Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're diving into something a lot of you asked about, which is basically how to uh, filter out all the noise in modern life and actually focus.
Yeah, how to figure out what really matters. And for this, we're digging into Mark Manson's book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck.
Right, we've gone through it, pulled out the key ideas. The mission here is to see how being more selective about, well, what we give a damn about can maybe lead to a better life.
And you got to admit it, that title grabs you immediately. It's provocative.
Totally. It suggests maybe the answer isn't always more effort, but something else.
Mm-hmm. And Manson points to Charles Bukowski, the poet. Kind of an unlikely inspiration.
Bukowski, yeah, gritty stuff. His epitaph was, "Don't try."
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that becomes this weird sort of theme. Maybe stop trying so hard at everything.
Okay, but let's be clear. Not giving a fuck. It's not like becoming totally indifferent, is it?
No, definitely not. It's more about being smart with your focus, like
Mm.
deciding consciously what gets your mental energy based on your values.
Instead of just reacting to every little thing that pops up.
Precisely. Which brings us to one of the first big ideas he talks about, this thing called the feedback loop from hell.
Ah, yes. The brain doing that annoying thing it does. Can you unpack that a bit?
Well, it's like you feel anxious, and then you start feeling anxious about feeling anxious.
Right. Or you get angry, and then you get angry at yourself for getting angry.
It just layers on top of itself. You feel bad about feeling bad.
So, like, stage fright before presentation, and then you panic because you feel nervous,
Yeah,
that kind of
exactly.
thing.
Double anxiety.
Yeah.
Or, something minor ticks you off, and then you're furious with yourself for being bothered by something so small.
It just feeds itself. So
Yeah.
the idea is if you just sort of acknowledge the feeling without judging it.
Yeah, just accept it. Like,
Right.
okay, I feel anxious right now. And by doing that, you kind of stop it from spiraling. You take away its fuel.
And modern life, especially like social media, seems designed to make this worse.
Oh, absolutely. It's a highlight reel, isn't it?
Totally. Perfect engagements, amazing jobs, flawless kids.
Everything looks amazing online.
Yeah.
And it creates this pressure, this illusion that if you're having a bad day or feeling negative, you're somehow failing.
Because everyone else seems so happy.
Right. Which is where Manson's idea offers like an off-ramp.
By just accepting. Accepting that life isn't always perfect.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Accepting that things can be messy, that it's okay to feel bad sometimes. It's part of being human.
So you don't have to beat yourself up for feeling down.
Exactly. You just interrupt that loop. Yeah, this situation sucks, but okay. The self-criticism starts to ease off.
Okay, so that leads into the subtle part of the art, right? It's not pure apathy.
Not at all. There are nuances. Subtlety number one.
Is that it's about being indifferent to the unimportant things.
Yes. You consciously choose where your fucks go, basically.
Like not caring about your coworker's coffee preference versus, say, not caring if your kid is unhappy. Big difference.
Huge difference.
Yeah.
And subtlety number two builds on that. To not give a fuck about adversity.
You first have to give a fuck about something more important than the adversity.
Right. He tells that story about the elderly lady fighting over a coupon at the grocery store. Remember that?
Oh, yeah, the 30-cent coupon. It seems trivial, but
But for her, in that moment, maybe fighting for that tiny discount, it wasn't just about the money. Maybe it was about control or dignity. Something bigger was at stake for her.
so the cashier refusing it felt like a bigger offense. It touched on something that mattered more to her than just 30 cents.
Exactly. And connecting that outwards, it's about, well, maturity, isn't it?
Learning what's actually worth getting worked up about, like Bunk Moreland in The Wire.
Huh. Yeah. Only giving a damn when it's really damn worthy.
And Manson points out something interesting about getting older, too.
That we naturally get better at this.
Yeah, kinda. You gain perspective. Stuff that felt huge when you were younger. You look back and realize it wasn't such a big deal.
You see that most people aren't really paying that much attention to your little anxieties anyway.
Right, so you start simplifying. You focus your care on fewer things, but things that really matter.
Your core relationships, maybe, or pursuits that genuinely mean something to you. And that simplification, weirdly, can lead to more contentment.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Let's talk about happiness itself. Manson argues it's not, like, a destination you arrive at.
No, definitely not a solvable equation. He brings in ideas from Buddhism, but also this character he invented, Disappointment Panda.
Disappointment Panda, I love that concept. Tell us about him.
Okay, so imagine this panda, right? But he's brutally honest. He shows up and tells you the hard truths you probably don't want to hear but maybe need to hear.
Like the antidote to toxic positivity.
Kinda. He's there to remind us that, hey, life involves struggle, Dissatisfaction is normal, even necessary sometimes.
And Disappointment Panda delivers that killer line, don't hope for a life without problems.
Hope for a life full of good
So
problems.
happiness isn't about avoiding problems, it's about solving them, engaging with them.
Exactly. It's the process of solving problems that brings satisfaction. It's active, not passive.
Which is the total opposite of what he calls the victim mentality.
Right, where you blame everything external for your issues, even when you could potentially do something about them.
And blaming others might feel good for a second, maybe protects the ego.
But long term, it leaves you feeling powerless, maybe resentful. Actually tackling the problems, even though it's hard, is where the real reward is.
He also talks about emotions here. Negative emotions aren't just bad, they're signals.
Yeah, like a dashboard warning light. Pain, emotional or physical, it's feedback. It's telling you something needs attention.
So anger, sadness, anxiety, they're calls to action, pointing to unresolved issues.
And positive emotions are like the reward for taking the right action, for addressing those issues.
But crucially, he says don't just blindly trust your emotions.
Right. Just because something feels good doesn't mean it is good for you long term, and vice versa. Sometimes hard things lead to good outcomes. You need to question them.
Which leads us neatly into this idea of choosing your struggles.
Because anything worthwhile involves some kind of sacrifice, right? You can't have pleasure without some form of pain or success without effort. They define each other.
So true satisfaction comes from choosing which difficulties you're willing to face, not trying to dodge everything unpleasant.
Exactly. And he asks that really important question. What is the pain that you want to sustain?
Oof, that cuts deep. It's not just what do you want, but what are you willing to suffer for?
Yeah. It separates wanting the result from wanting the actual process. You mentioned wanting to be a musician.
Oh, totally. I loved the idea of being on stage, the applause, whatever. But did I love the hours of practice, the dealing with rejection, the lugging gear? Not so much.
And that's the difference. The people who make it often find some enjoyment, or at least meaning, in the struggle itself.
The struggle defines you, in a way.
It really does. Okay, so let's move on to another potential pitfall. The tyranny of exceptionalism and entitlement.
This connects back to the victim mentality, but also this modern pressure to be, well, amazing all the time.
Right. Manson critiques how the self-esteem movement sometimes focuses too much on just feeling good,
As opposed to.
how you feel about your negative aspects, your flaws.
Yeah.
He argues real self-worth involves accepting those too. He uses this character, Jimmy, as an example.
Ah, Jimmy. The guy who talks a big game, super confident, but never actually does anything.
That's him, full of self-belief, completely detached from reality or actual effort.
Which is kind of the definition of entitlement, isn't it?
Pretty much. Feeling you deserve amazing things, success, admiration, happiness, without earning them, without the struggle we just talked about.
It creates a bubble around you.
And if you're in that bubble, any challenge, any criticism feels like a huge injustice because you feel you deserve better just because. It links back to feeling like a victim when things don't go your way.
And the media landscape doesn't help.
Not at all. We're constantly shown the extremes, right? The billionaires, the prodigies, the disasters, the outliers.
Which makes normal life feel inadequate, boring.
Yeah, it skews our perception. We start thinking exceptional is the norm, and if we're not exceptional, we feel insecure.
Leading maybe to compensating with entitlement or maybe addiction or something else.
He even brings up Hiru Onoda.
The Japanese soldier who hid for decades after WWII ended, believing it was still going on.
Yeah, him. And Norio Suzuki, the adventurer who found him. It's an extreme example, but it shows how people can dedicate their lives to, well, to false ideas, clinging to certainty when reality has changed.
Okay, so if exceptionalism and entitlement are traps, where should we focus? This brings us to values and metrics.
Right. Simple definitions. Values are what you care about deep down. Metrics are how you measure if you're living up to those values.
And picking the wrong metrics can mess you up, even if your values are good.
Totally. You mentioned your relationship with your brother.
Yeah, my value was having a good relationship, but my metric was like how often we talked on the phone. When that didn't happen much, I felt like a failure as a brother.
Even though the underlying value, the respect and care, was still there.
Exactly. The metric was flawed. Manson uses Dave Mustaine from Megadeth as another example.
Ah, yeah. Hugely successful musician, right. But apparently he spent years measuring himself against Metallica.
His old band. So his metric was, am I bigger than Metallica? Which, is a tough comparison for almost anyone.
And it reportedly made it hard for him to appreciate his own massive success. Compare that to Pete Best.
The original Beatles drummer, kicked out right before they got huge. Ouch.
Massive ouch. But the story goes he eventually found happiness.
How? By changing his values and metrics. He prioritized family, a more normal life. He found contentment based on those measures, not on being a Beatle.
And that's the punchline, really. Self-improvement isn't about achieving more external stuff, necessarily. It's about choosing better things to care about, better values.
Which leads to better problems and, hopefully, a better life.
Mm-hmm. Now, a really crucial distinction Manson makes is between responsibility and fault. People mix these up all the time.
They really do. Fault is about who caused something, right? Who's to blame?
Exactly. But responsibility,
Mm.
that's about how you respond to the situation, whatever it is, even if it's not your fault.
He uses William James, the philosopher, as an example.
Yeah, James had loads of health problems his whole life. Not his fault, but he eventually decided to take responsibility for living his life despite them. That was his choice.
Contrast that with the story of the guy complaining about being short and blaming women for his dating failures.
Right. He wasn't at fault for his height, but blaming it entirely, refusing to take responsibility for, say, his attitude or social skills, that kept him stuck and unhappy.
Yeah.
His choice of where to place responsibility was poor.
Your own story about being dumped fits here too, right?
Definitely. Initially, it's natural to feel like she's responsible for my misery.
Sure. Blame feels easier.
But the shift happens when you realize, okay, she made her choice, but my happiness, my moving forward, that's on me now. That's my responsibility.
And that's when you started working on yourself, which led to better things later.
Exactly. Taking responsibility, even when it sucks, even when it's unfair, that's where the power is. That's where you learn and grow.
Which ties into genetics choices and this phrase he uses, victimhood chic.
Yeah, it's complex. He mentions that BBC documentary about teenagers with OCD.
Oh, right. Imogen, Josh, Jack. They didn't choose to have OCD, obviously. That's genetics, biology, whatever. Not their fault.
Not at all. But the documentary showed how managing it, living with it, came down to their choices, accepting imperfections, focusing on their values, despite the condition.
And Jack had that amazing realization. I didn't choose this life, but I get to choose how to live with it.
Such a powerful way to put it. Life deals you cards, some good, some bad. Not your fault. But the game is how you play those cards. That's your choice, your responsibility.
And this confusion between responsibility and fault is what lets people sometimes pass the buck, avoid ownership.
And then he talks about victimhood chic, especially online.
Where playing the victim gets rewarded with attention, sympathy, clicks.
Kind of. Sometimes it feels like there's a competition for who's the most wronged. Ryan Holiday calls it outrage porn, getting hooked on feeling offended or seeing others get shamed.
And the danger, Manson argues, is it distracts from people who are actually victimized.
And it can become addictive, this constant need to feel slighted.
Okay, shifting again. Let's talk about doubt and failure. We usually see these as negatives, but Manson flicks that.
He really does. He argues that certainty is the enemy of growth.
Certainty, like being too sure you're right.
Exactly. If you're convinced you already know everything, or that your beliefs are perfect, where's the room to learn, to change?
So we should actively seek out doubt, question ourselves.
Yes. Be open to being wrong, because being wrong is how you find out what's more right. It's how you grow.
He also makes the point that we don't always know if an experience is truly good or bad at the time.
Right. Sometimes the toughest times teach us the most. And sometimes easy successes make us complacent. Hindsight changes things.
He mentions a psych experiment, people pressing buttons randomly.
Yeah, and how quickly they invented patterns and reasons for why things were happening, even when it was totally random. We need to make meaning, even if we have to invent it.
And our brains are biased towards confirming what we already believe. Memory is unreliable too, like that telephone game.
Totally. The story gets distorted with each retelling. He uses the really intense example of Meredith.
The woman who developed false memories of childhood abuse.
Yes, fueled by her own values, maybe suggestions from therapy, life experiences. Her brain constructed a narrative that felt incredibly real, but wasn't factually accurate. It's a stark reminder of how powerful, and sometimes flawed, our meaning-making process is.
So the takeaway is trust ourselves less, be more skeptical of our own certainties.
Pretty much. Practice self-skepticism, because absolute certainty can be dangerous. Think of conspiracy theorists or extremists.
He tells that anecdote about Aaron, the self-improvement junkie with really rigid, extreme beliefs.
Yeah. Certainty locked her into a narrow view. Uncertainty, admitting I don't know, is actually the starting point for all progress, all learning.
But challenging our core beliefs is hard because our identity gets wrapped up in them.
It really does. Which is why failure can actually be, well, the way forward.
You mentioned graduating during the recession.
Yeah. It felt like total failure at the time. Couldn't get a decent job. But looking back, starting at rock bottom meant I wasn't afraid to try weird things, to take risks. What was the worst that could happen?
You were already there.
Exactly. There's a weird freedom in that. Manson calls it the failure-success paradox.
Explain that.
If you only focus on a specific goal, like get promoted, reaching it is kind of the end. But if you value the process like Picasso, valuing honest expression, there's no end point. You just keep going, keep growing, keep expressing. Failure is just part of that process.
He brings in Kazimierz Dabrowski's research, too, on WWII survivors.
Yeah, Dabrowski argued that intense negative experiences, trauma even, can sometimes force a kind of psychological growth spurt. Positive disintegration, he called it.
So our worst moments can actually trigger the biggest shifts in perspective, when our old ways of thinking clearly aren't working anymore.
That's the idea. Failure forces us to reevaluate, to find new values, new ways of being.
Okay, so if failure is okay and uncertainty is good,
Yeah.
what do? This brings us to action and commitment.
Right. Sometimes we overthink things. He uses the funny analogy of figuring out an old VCR.
You don't read the manual cover to cover first.
No. You just start pressing buttons, see what happens, learn by doing. Action leads to understanding.
And he says motivation often follows action, not the other way around.
Exactly. We wait to feel motivated, but often just starting something, taking that first step, creates the motivation. It's a loop. Inspiration leads to motivation.
He talks about VCR questions in life, too, those big decisions.
Like dropping out of a degree you hate, or asking someone out, or ending a bad relationship. From the outside, the answer seems obvious.
Just press the button.
Right. But from the inside, the fear of the discomfort, the potential pain, paralyzes you. You avoid taking action.
He shares his own experience with travel, too. Years of flitting around superficially.
Yeah, seeing lots of places, but not really engaging deeply anywhere. He realized that breadth has diminishing returns.
Compared to the rewards of depth, of committing to something.
He found more meaning in committing. He even mentions enjoying the bluntness in Russia.
In St. Petersburg, finding the directness, the lack of sugarcoating, kind of liberating, because it involved accepting rejection as normal.
Exactly. It connects to this idea that real appreciation often requires limits, commitment, saying no to some things so you can say a deeper yes to others.
He brings up the paradox of choice here, too.
Oh, yeah. Having tons of options sounds great, but studies show it often makes us less satisfied with whatever we choose. We always wonder about the roads not taken.
So, commitment to a relationship, a career, a place, whatever, isn't a trap. It's actually freeing.
In a way, yes. By choosing what matters and rejecting the distractions, you gain focus, depth, and potentially more satisfaction. You're free from the tyranny of infinite possibilities.
Okay, finally, the last chapter. It's a good one. And then you die.
Sounds grim, but it's actually incredibly clarifying.
He starts with the story of his friend Josh dying suddenly.
Yeah, a really powerful personal story. And the realization that hit him was profound, facing the absolute certainty of death. Suddenly, a lot of everyday fears just seemed insignificant.
Why worry about embarrassment or failure when the end result is the same for everyone?
Exactly. Death becomes this ultimate perspective giver, the light by which the meaning of everything else is measured, as he puts it.
He brings in Ernest Becker's work here, the denial of death.
Right. Becker argued that a lot of human behavior is driven by this underlying death terror, this fear of our physical selves ending.
So we try to create a conceptual self that lasts. Through achievements, legacy, beliefs, our values become immortality projects.
That's the idea. We build things, strive for things, identify with things, partly to feel like some part of us will transcend death.
But Becker's solution, the bitter antidote, is
to actually confront that, to question our conceptual selves, our need for legacy, and become more comfortable with the idea of our own physical end.
easier said than done.
For sure. But the goal is liberation. Once you accept your mortality, you're freer to choose values based on what actually matters to you in this life, not based on some unconscious drive for symbolic immortality.
You mentioned your experience at the Cape of Good Hope, feeling that sense of smallness against the vastness.
Yeah, standing there, looking at it, that huge ocean, thinking about time and nature, it just puts your own ego, your own little worries into perspective. Makes the superficial stuff seem really trivial.
So legacy isn't about giant monuments, but maybe just how the world is slightly different, maybe better because you were here.
That seems closer to Manson's point. And greatness isn't necessarily about fame or fortune. It's about continuing to choose what matters, what you give a fuck about, even when life is confusing, even knowing it all ends.
And the final takeaway from his friend Josh's death.
Was simply, there is nothing to be afraid of. Not really. Accepting death, paradoxically, makes life feel lighter, freer.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this all up, this deep dive into the subtle art.
The big themes seem to be choose your fucks wisely, embrace problems as part of life, maybe even good problems. Watch out for entitlement, take responsibility, even when it's not your fault.
And use the awareness of mortality not to despair, but to clarify what truly matters right now.
Yeah, it all comes back to that Bukowski epitaph, don't try. Not literally do nothing, but
Stop trying so hard to impress, to achieve external validation, to avoid pain.
exactly. Let go of the struggle for things that don't align with your deeper values. Focus your energy where it counts.
So for everyone listening, maybe take a moment to think about your own values. What really, truly deserves your attention, your energy?
What are you choosing to give a fuck about?
And here's that final thought. If you really consider that your time is finite, how does that change what you prioritize starting today?